culminated in the SABC getting its well, for the longest of time, it had never got a clean audit. And the concern was that needed to be turned around rapidly. It was crucial. I mean, it was part of financial management and organizational management to be able to keep track of everything and have the supporting documents to show where business was going right and where it was going wrong. So that was the one strategic area. The second one had to be with the launch of the news channel, the SABC news channel. Quite a critical component from the perspective of being able to test our capability to run a 24-hour news channel, so that when we migrated to DTT, then we would have a well-tested system that could run efficiently. So that was the second strategic area. The third one had to do with the skills within the organization. It was very, very clear right from the outset that particularly in the area of finance, there was a very big shortage of critical skills there. And when we put the proposal to the board that we ran a skills audit, it became like a natural thing to do. Why was the skills audit necessary? It was not geared towards getting rid of people. It was geared towards understanding what skills were in the organization which potentially could be improved, who were sitting in the wrong positions, because the overall result you would then see in the general running of the business. So it was a critical aspect that had to be done. There was a raft of human resource policies that had to be reviewed in order to ensure that the organizational behavior was realigned to running the organization in a manner that would help it meet its objectives. Of particular concern was our ability to operate effectively and efficiently when DTT came around. So that was a critical area as well. I've already mentioned finance as one of them. And I can't recall all of them, but I would say those were the top ones.
Now, you were meant to be at the SABC for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017. When did you leave?
I left on my last day was the 28th of February, 2014.
You roughly stayed just over 2 years.
Yes, it was, I would say, 2 years and possibly a few weeks.
At that stage, how far had you gone in terms of the marching orders you were given by the board, in terms of implementing those?
The skills audit had been done and completed, and we presented it to the Portfolio Committee on Communications, as I can recall. It was highly publicized. It was done. The news channel was launched, albeit amid the controversy around the agreement with MultiChoice and a lot of unhappiness that was expressed around having a platform on MultiChoice instead of having it on SABC. There were serious concerns around that, but it was indeed launched. Financial management drastically improved. I will submit that on the audit findings perspective, we actually did a nosedive and ended up with a disclaimer in 2013. I'm not going to excuse the disclaimer. It had a lot to do with where having too many balls and trying to balance all of them and just losing focus on some of the critical areas. I think Mr. Lubisi has eloquently stated the work that the audit committee, together with the internal audit functionary and the executive, embarked on to make sure that all of these things were turned around. So that was achieved. The human resource policies became a contentious area because with some of the policies, it was felt that the labor unions needed to be involved. The processes were hugely protracted because everything had to be negotiated. So that did not go as well as I had hoped it would. I do believe that had I stayed on beyond the 2 years, that we possibly could have been able today to have had a very meaningful set of policies that could be implemented and followed by the staff.
Of course, for a group CEO to succeed, you need the support, the backing of your board. During your tenure, what was the relationship between yourself and your board?
The relationship, let me begin with the relationship between the board itself. It was highly fractious. And I think the subcommittee, not the subcommittee, sorry, the Parliamentary Committee on Communications was exposed to huge fights that were happening between the board members themselves. And part of the problem was the camps that the board itself had created. In one of the main governance report that I believe has not been sent to the subcommittee, the ad hoc committee, it clearly points to the two centers of power that had developed at the SABC.
You served under the Dr. Ngubane board.
Yes.
You served under the interim board.
Yes.
And you had a stint with the current board.
Not the current board in its current form. I left before Ms. Chabalala resigned, before she resigned. So I, for all intents and purposes, it was the Dr. Ngubane and the Ms. Chabalala boards that I served under.
Now, when you refer to huge fights between board members and the camps, to which one are you referring to?
There was I think if we take a moment and reflect back to the time when Dr. Ngubane's board dissolved, indeed there were a great deal of fights within there. And the fights would sometimes spill over into the media, and they were hugely embarrassing. Within there were board members that seemed to surround Mr. Motsweni very tightly. And there were those who were seen as outside and therefore being the Lulama board. Very, very uncomfortable.
Sorry, who were those that were seen to be around Mr. Motsweni, and who were those that were seen to be around Ms. Makhobo?
It's not easy for me to mention names, but I think in my opening statements I mentioned that Dr. Ngubane was very close to Hlaudi. And there were about 4 other members of the board that were very close to him.
If you could share the names with the committee, because you see, you're making the statement that there were 2 camps, and I think it's only fair for the committee to know who those who belonged to which camp.
Who supported who?
Yes.
I'm taking a very big risk here. I was aware that people like board member Lumko Mtinde, together with later Mr. Mavuso, Dr. Kumalo, Professor Kumalo. I can't recall all of them immediately, leaned very much towards my understanding. I came from a very strong academic background, and I think because of that, it was easy for us to understand each other in the strategic direction and operational direction that I felt needed to be done. But there were others. I don't think it would be fair for me to mention their names. I will be accused of slander, who nonetheless were very close to Hlaudi.
And they would be the ones that you have not mentioned?
Yes.
You were still explaining these two different camps before I rudely interrupted you. I'm sorry for that.
I had very big difficulties. The report that the governance report, for instance, pointed out that group executive meetings were not run well. And what I can state categorically now, and some of the executives who have left would confirm it, is that most of the time, the group executive meetings that are called, which were diarized and had to happen, would be undermined by Mr. Mutweni. He would call his team. They would have other important things to do. And I would have to fight to have people stay and do their work within the committees. The extent to which I was undermined was unbearable. And as things would go, if the power of the leader is constantly eroded, and word goes around that this leader is useless, she is lazy, she's conflicted, she's got shares at ETV, her children work for ETV, she is all kinds, a litany of things that were said about me. The organization begins to view the leader as somebody who cannot be trusted, who is weak. And the one who seems strong, who is in fact driving these messages, then becomes the one who is seen as the leader. Those were the two camps, those were the two centers of power.
But you were in charge. The COO, the CFO, until the cleaner at the SABC reported to you. You seem to have had a difficulty with one of your direct reports in the form of the acting COO. He was even acting at the time.
Yes, he was acting at the time.
What impeded you from dealing with him as your director within the confines of the law?
I raised the issue. In fact, I requested 3 board members who were in his camp to assist me with removing him, because how things worked there, you had to lobby people sometimes to get them to understand where you were going and agree with you. And I raised the fact that there seemed to be a lack of understanding. Perhaps I was wrong, but a lack of understanding on his part as to what his role really was. And my suggestion to them was that he be found a different role. Now, I was in absolute shock when the following day, well, it was the same day, I can't quite recall, Mr. Mutweni marched into my office absolutely furious, telling me that I shouldn't forget that if it were not for him, I would not be at the SABC. And that, in fact, those board members are so angry with me that I could possibly be fired. And thereafter, well, of course, I fought, I fought back and told him the context of my discussion with those people. And then thereafter, the strong rumors began to emerge. There were rumors that I would not be at the organization beyond August 2013. I had started in February. Suddenly, stories were being planted about me in the newspapers. I think the story of Mngqibisa, Phosani Mngqibisa, who is indeed my nephew, and I'll never deny that, and his relationship and how my son worked with Phosani. Everything that was put out in the media at that time was put out in order for me to seem like a totally dishonest, dishonorable person to the worst degree. It was a very painful period for me.
The 3 board members that you had approached, can you give us their names that you were lobbying?
I would be hesitant to do that. Again, because I will be accused of slander. And secondly, I do not have the proof. There was no camera. I cannot show you a clip that says definitively, these are the people who were there.
Okay. The delegation of authority framework, ma'am, sorry, because of time, I only have an hour, so I have to touch on different issues. The delegation of authority framework, how often was that document reviewed at your time at the SABC?
When I was at the SABC, we applied the old delegation of authority framework, which was very clear and consistent and delineated responsibilities very clearly. Towards my departure, a review was being done, and that review was essentially giving the executive far greater powers than they'd had previously. What Mr. Lubisi alluded to about executives essentially being given the right to appoint executives was one of the big areas that were changed. And also the levels of expenditure were changed. I wasn't there long enough to influence it differently. And in any case, at that time, relationships had broken down quite substantially.
This delegation of authority framework, my understanding is that it took certain powers of the board, delegated it to the executive directors. Now, who was responsible at your time for that particular arrangement?
The framework was, I'm trying to recall now because we're talking almost 3 years ago. The framework was reviewed by the group executive. I seem to recall that there were vigorous discussions on what needed to change and why. Part of the need had to do with how we could manage board involvement in the daily running of the SABC. It was a very frustrating thing because the executive found it difficult sometimes to make rapid decisions and respond very rapidly to market dynamics, such as needing to very quickly go and secure a programming deal or an event or whatever that would give it the competitive advantage. So those were kind of like the base things that had to be looked at. But I think what then happened was some of the powers that should have vested with the board were then devolved. But that was outside of my time period within that organization.
During your time, how did the board oversee their delegated power to the executive?
There were subcommittees of the board that were formed. I think Mr. Lubisi alluded to that. There were about 6, if I'm not mistaken, perhaps slightly more, which worked directly with the group executives in receiving strategies and reports, whether it was updates or any other reports. And then the subcommittee chairs would then present those to the board for ratification, approval, or whatever was required, or information.
What were the powers of these subcommittees? Did these subcommittees make any binding decisions? And if so, were there any documents that had empowered them to make such binding decisions, or were they just making recommendations to the board?
They made recommendations to the board.
Would there be a regulatory framework or policy document that regulates that kind of an arrangement?
Yes, yes, indeed.
What would it be?
That would be the delegation of authority document, which prescribed exactly what decisions needed to be taken where.
You resigned before the expiry of your time. Can you share the circumstances surrounding your resignation with the committee?
There were several periods when I disagreed with some of the decisions that were being made. And in those times, I would run head on with the chairperson, with Hlaudi, and with the chairperson. And our relationship deteriorated to the point where we actually had very, how do I put it, unbecoming arguments in the board. Now, things got to a point where the rumor mill started again. And there were talks of me being suspended. There were talks of investigations that were being done against me, like the ones that I mentioned right at the beginning. Being a shareholder at ETV, children working for ETV, me making bad decisions about certain people, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, I decided that there was the writing was on the wall. I had been so maligned that staying on at the SABC just didn't make any sense to me anymore at all. But also, at that point, I believed I had done substantial work in helping, together with my small team of people who worked directly with me. We had made big headway in turning the financials of the organization around and other things that needed to happen, and that it was time to go.
I'll be interested. I mean, you were the CEO. How we judge you would be about the performance financially and the performance of the institution. At that stage, how were the finances of the SABC? How financially viable was the corporation?
I don't have the exact figure in my head, but certainly very viable. The SABC had made clear profits of over 300 million rand. And the previous year, it had been over 200 million rand. And there was over 1 billion rand cash in the bank. And at that point, we were ready to launch a new programming slate and had put out a call to the industry to submit proposals for a slate that would go to the tune of 600 million. So a lot was achieved to the point that the government guarantee had been paid off. All our debts were settled. Whatever debts were outstanding had to do with, which had been long-term, had to do with litigation cases that had been ongoing.
One of your mandates related to austerity measures that you had to implement. And how far had you gone in terms of that?
We had, I'm saying we, but I don't like to say I because I worked with a team of people. We had gone quite a way toward stabilizing the finances, dealing with the audit issues. Mr. Aguma had been appointed by Mutsoning, and he was very, very useful in helping us to establish a proper system of making sure that our audits were done properly, and therefore the reports we would not have really big qualification issues coming out. The content issues had stabilized. We had a very big problem with media houses, the production houses that had to shut down because there was no money to pay them, and we're slowly bringing them back. There's so many things, I can't just recall all of them.
Your editorial policy designated you at the time as the chief editorial, whatever.
Editor-in-chief.
Editor-in-chief, yes. Mm-hmm. How was news independence maintained during your time?
I must contextualize this. News essentially had to play a role of providing news without fear or favor, while ensuring that the balance of views was captured within the news. So if there was a report going out, let us say on you, Mr. Vanara, it was critical that you had the right of reply, and it was captured there. The head of news and his team had the right to select any news that they wanted to carry. However, if in the carriage of their responsibility, there were complaints that were put to me about certain views that were being given undue coverage and others being suppressed, or if the head of news came to me and said, I'm having difficulty with this issue, can you help me with it? Then I would offer my opinion and I would assist where it was necessary to assist, whether it was by way of explaining to a party that felt badly done with to understand why we did the things that we did. However, if indeed in the carriage of his responsibility, the head of news seemed to be completely biased and unfair in their approach to news, I had the right to request him to give me whatever information that I needed, whether it was to understand why he was doing it, what the frequency was, and also to come up with remedial action.
The public protector's report, how was it handled whilst you were at the SABC?
When I left on the 28th of February 2014, it had just been released. So I was not there when any work was done around it. I had already left the SABC. However, I was aware that I was mentioned in there, and I would love to give context to my role that was mentioned in a very negative light in there.
I would like to give you that opportunity
to give the context.
To deal with
Indeed.
issues.
The public protector was concerned about a salary increase. Initially, she thought that I had been involved in a whole range of salary increases for Mr. Mutsweni, but I'd been involved in only one increase. And that increase was done at a time when the organization was going through a rebalancing of salary packages. I can't quite remember the word that was used internally to enable that process. Parity, it was called parity. And one of the instruments of checking parity was to look at what salaries were being paid at a particular level. And if indeed somebody's salary was below par and yet there was a general belief that they were delivering, then their salary had to be reviewed. And that's how Mr. Mutswening's salary was reviewed. He had complained that it was way too low. He had been given accolade after accolade by the board. So much had been said about the work that he did. Received a very glorious motivation from HR about him. And so the new salary was put down, and it was up to the chairman to approve it. The chairman agreed that indeed it had to be reviewed, and that was the salary that he was given.
If you say the chairman approved, my understanding is the chairpersons of the board of the SABC are not executive chairpersons.
The assumption at the time was that the chairman of the board could could on behalf of the board make certain decisions. Issues of parity were being handled along similar lines. So the chairman of the board, representing the board, therefore then signed for Mr. Mutsweni to receive his salary increase.
Lastly, there was no performance management system at the time. Were there any performance bonuses that were paid to executives and members of staff? And if so, in terms of what regime?
Let me just correct you there, because when I left, a system had indeed been designed, and it was ready for implementation. And in fact, a whole range of executives I evaluated against that performance management system. There had been a stoppage on bonuses simply because of the austerity period that we were going through. But also, performance bonuses had to be linked to actual performance. And year 3 was possibly going to be the year when we would link the assessments to an actual bonus. That would be at executive level. At lower management and staff level, there would be the 13th check, which generally people call a bonus. But it is, in fact, a 13th check, which would be awarded to staff at the end of the year. That was contained in the policies of the SABC, and it would be negotiated with the unions and taken to the board for approval. And if the board approved, then the staff would get it. During my period there was no performance bonus given to the executive team at all. None of the people who reported to me got that.
The very last issue relates to the multi-choice contract. I'm not going to ask you about its details. I'm interested in the role of the board, and my understanding is that you, as the group CEO at the time, you did not enter into negotiations, and you were not the one that signed the agreement. Can you explain how that came about?
There were two very contentious clauses, which can be summarized simply as the issue of the set-top box control. The broadcast digital migration policy, which is what had informed developments around DTT, had come with a provision for a set-top box control to be included in the new set-top boxes. And effectively what that would enable the public to do is that the public could access e-services. They could get into the internet and work on the internet right from home. It didn't matter how poor they were, but if they had a set-top box and it had a return path, then they'd be able to do that. Sadly, this argument was seen rather as a way to enrich a few manufacturers, which didn't make sense. And there was a strong drive to not include it. Even the multi-choice agreement itself insisted on non-inclusion of that. That, I think, alone was the biggest reason why I had to go, where my relationship just deteriorated to the point of no return. During that week when the contract was signed, I'd gone on leave. My granddaughter was not well. And in my absence, it was quickly pushed through and signed. My stance against that particular aspect was very well known, and I still stand by it today.
No further questions, Chair.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Honorable Killian, your 5 minutes starts now. I had warned you that we're going to start on this side.
Chair, I would like to ask Ms. Mkobo.
Mogobo.
Okay. Mogobo.
Yes, ma'am.
Can I just ask her, when she started, she was correct, she started during a very serious period for the SABC. When did you determine that there was a serious breakdown and the factions within the SABC board started? What prompted that? What prompted that feeling? Was there any particular incident?
There were a number of incidents. I think the Dr. Ngubane period did not affect me as badly as the Mrs. Shabalala period. In that term, the negativity around me was just untenable. Meetings were being held with executives without my presence. I would be shouted at and admonished in front of my junior staff for no reason. And generally, it just became totally untenable. I must say that during Dr. Ngubane's time, when my frustrations were shooting high, he was the one who would calm me down. In all fairness, he's the one who would say, don't go, stay. But when the other chair came on board, it just was, it was incredibly difficult.
Can you tell us, during your term, there was a specific position created, GE stakeholder relations and provinces, etc. How did it come about that Mr. Motsoeneng was appointed, and what was Dr. Ngubane's role in that? Was it ever approved by the board?
The board, prior to my going into the SABC, had done a very strong strategic direction, and reviewing the structures was part of their responsibility. So yes, they put that role in. The decision to appoint Mr. Motsoeneng to that happened while I was not there yet, but it was entirely a board decision, I believe.
Chair, can Ms. Mogobo perhaps tell us when the public protector released the interim report? She was still at the SABC. When that showed up very clear problems surrounding the appointment of Mr. Motsoeneng, what steps did you take, that you engaged, that you presented to the board? How did the board deal with the interim report?
Gosh, I need to try and recall this. The interim report went to the chairman of the board. I'm sorry, I can't quite recall whether it was discussed at the board. However, specific questions were given, in particular to myself, which I responded to at length. My response is here, and I do believe that the Public Protector report is a public document now, so I would be happy to hand this in so that it can be seen. But being an interim report, then it was not, I don't think it was dealt with vigorously within the organization. It was more a matter of issues are raised, let's respond to the issues that are raised. And I responded to those that affected me directly. I believe Mr. Motsoeneng dealt with his, and I don't know about the other board members. And I'm saying I don't know because the approach was very individual. It was, gosh, I'm mentioned here, I'd better respond. And the responses were sent back. Yeah.
Unfortunately, your time is up, ma'am. Mr. Chauke?
No, thank you very much, Chair. During your time when you were harassed by Mr. Motsoeneng, did the board or the chairman of the board intervene to try and resolve or to address this harassment? The second harassment, this newspaper reporting, which were false. Did you take any action either through the ombudsman, or did you ever complain to the newspapers that what they are reporting is not factual? The other question of yours is around the you keep on saying that part of the harassment was that your child worked for ETV. Is it correct or it's not? If so, how did it impact into your work? Those are my current 2-3 questions for now. And yeah, thanks, Chair.
Can I start with the ETV matter? It was completely false. And it just pushed me to the point where I realized how much people hated me, to the point of manufacturing stories like that. None of my children have ever worked for ETV. Yes, I was one of the people who were in the bid team that won the license for ETV, and we actually started, but then I left later, and I had no relationship with ETV beyond that. The reporting in the newspapers, when some of the journalists came back with follow-up issues, I responded to those. I think probably at the time I naively believed that people would know me, that's naive thing, that even if people say bad things about me, but other people know who I am. And so I did not take the matters to the Ombudsman. And there's a very recent case where the newspapers came up with this big article that said I had received 11 million rands in 8 months. And it was put down as a matter of fact. And it was totally untrue. And at that point, I think I was exhausted. I was just too beaten. I didn't defend myself. I didn't do anything about it. I just left it. The correct thing should have been for me to deal with it. My apologies. The first question had been...
That was the issue of Mr. Ngubane as the chairperson of the board having to intervene on your harassment.
Yes, I tried several times to inform the board members, including the deputy chair of the board and Mr. Ngubane, Dr. Ngubane. But my complaints were seen more as crybaby. In fact, a statement was made that I did not want to take responsibility for anything. Therefore, I was a bad CEO. A CEO takes responsibility. Even if you have a staff member who does not do their work and that staff member has far greater power than you do because of who they know, well, if you can't deal with it, then it means you're not good.
The last question, Chair. Again, newspaper report that alleges that we are paid 11 million. You're saying it's not in your way to respond on such issues. The public opinion is not everybody that knows you. Therefore, the public opinion majority then remains that you have been paid 11 million. Then it's fine, it's okay. You don't see any need that you need to take action because this is not the truth. Well, what makes you so comfortable not to want to engage on such matters?
I'm sorry, Honorable Chauke. I just didn't have the strength. I'm human. I'm just an ordinary human being. And I just didn't have the strength. And I knew that if I responded, then it would be a long, drawn-out matter. Then something else would come up, and another thing would come up, and yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Honorable Van Dam.
Thanks, Chairperson. Mrs. Mahobo, you said that the multi-choice deal was pushed through when you were not at work. Do you know who signed that contract then?
Mr. Motsoeneng.
Mr. Motsoeneng, and with the board?
And with, I think, the chair of the board.
Okay.
If you got that contract, you'd be able to to ascertain that.
We're waiting for it. Okay, I'm interested in your implication in the Public Protector's report. She says she recommended that remedial action be taken against you in the form of disciplinary action for approving Mr. Motsoneng's salary increase twice. The first time from 1.4 million to 1.7, and then 1.7 to 2.4 in the space of 1 year. In your in your responses to Mr. Vanara, you admit to the first increase, and you say
the second
increase. So both increases.
The first one was done before I was at the SABC, before I got there. So
Alright.
it's only one, the second one.
Yes. The Public Protector recommended that disciplinary steps against you be taken for approving that increase. What is your response to that?
I felt that the Public Protector had probably not understood the context, which is what I tried to provide here. That the increase was not, I think in her report, she said he was being paid as a COO. It was not in his position as an acting COO. It was purely in his position as Group Executive of Stakeholder Relations, and one who, I might add, had received all kinds of accolades, and I had no power to withhold that from him.
Right. The Public Protector yesterday, one of the remedial actions that she mentioned hadn't been implemented was those disciplinary steps against you. If you felt that that finding by the Public Protector was wrong and you do not agree with it, why didn't you take that matter on review? Why didn't you take that report on review? Because as we sit here, the SABC, there was a remedial action, a disciplinary action be taken against you, and it hasn't been taken, and you've left the matter and you haven't challenged it. So what stops that disciplinary action being taken against you?
It never occurred to me that I should take it on review. I just thought reason would prevail. I mean, the facts were there. Yes, I think I displayed a lot of naivety on matters of public information. That is quite true. Should have done it, but I didn't.
Now that you have
Secondly,
information,
because I left also, I'm not sure what remedial action could be taken against somebody who was no longer there.
okay, you received a settlement, and there isn't much clarity about how much that settlement was. How much was that settlement that you got from the SABC when you left 2 years into a 5-year term?
It was the equivalent of 1 year's salary, which was with benefits, so with the car allowance and leave pay and all of those things, which came up to, it came up to 4 million.
4 million.
And it was, I mean, that was almost a statutory requirement. You don't want a person in the organization, give them 1 year.
All right. Now, I mean, the impression that's created by all of this, you resign on the 2nd of February, the report comes out on the 14th of February. You would have seen the interim report which recommended that disciplinary action be taken against you. The impression that's created now is that you left because that report was coming out. Can you respond to that?
No. The discussion around my departure from the SABC began as early as November the previous year. I recall that when that final decision came through, there was a strategic session with the SABC board. And at that strategic session is where the then chair of the board, Ms. Shabalala, informed the board that we had agreed to separate. So it really had nothing to do with the Public Protector report. As I recall, one of the things that she mentioned about taking the remedial action, she said, well, you know, how do you take a remedial action against somebody who has resigned? I'm not sure what my rights are. I will certainly investigate those, because I didn't listen to the discussions yesterday. I wasn't aware that that still stands as an issue. I will take advice and see how I can progress this matter.
Thank you very much. Honourable Waters.
Thank you, Mrs. Mogobo. I hope I pronounced it right. Can you tell us, when you left the SABC, did you sign a confidentiality clause with them?
Indeed, sir. And that is the clause that I had discussions with Mr. Vanara about. And eventually I got a letter from the chairman basically stating that everything being done within the confines of this hall would remain safe from
That's
prosecution.
right. It's like
and
a
that
court
sort of
of
thing.
law
Yes.
type of thing. Yeah. Can you tell us then, were you aware of any fraudulent, illegal or irregular activities going on in the SABC?
The SIU report was probably the most telling of illegal, fraudulent activities that were going on within the organization. There was the case of the CFO. No, let me leave that. I don't think it's relevant to this discussion. But that SIU report was the most telling.
Okay. But that's in the public domain.
Yes.
So what were you concerned about? Why were you concerned about the confidentiality clause coming here if there was nothing to divulge?
What I'm divulging here today can, and it's been threatened, will be used against me. There was talk of people being sued, and yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks. Then with regards to Mr. Motseneng's 2 increases, I understand you were only involved in the 2nd increase, but the chairman of the board at the time, was he or she one of the people that you've said that some of the board members surrounded Mr. Motseneng tightly, to quote you, and that the board had a leaning towards Mr. Motseneng. Would he be one of those, or she be one of those people?
He was exceptionally close to the chair.
Okay, so we have a recommendation of 2 increases within a 4-month period, signed by someone that's very close to Mr. Motseneng. Did that not concern you at all?
You know, Honourable Waters, the reports that I got about Mr. Motseneng as I entered the organization were those that spoke of an extraordinary human being who deserved all kinds of accolades. A lot of what he had done before I got into the SABC. And I could not question the veracity of those, because those are things that he was supposed to have done. And so when the request came to me, I did not have any leg to stand on from the perspective of saying no, particularly because it had to do with parity. It had to do with putting him on a salary level that was, suitable for a person, a group executive member of his standing. I must emphasize that, of his standing.
Okay.
It was extraordinary how much adoration was poured on him. And at the time of the parity exercise, I did not have the opportunity to really study him.
I mean, if board members are very close to him, there'd be a lot of admiration, and and other people. So, you also mentioned earlier on that you refused to sign off on certain contracts when you first got into the position. Can you give us some indication of what contracts they were? Was it?
There was one that was particularly concerning, which had to do with the collection of VAT revenues from SARS, and the proposal was that that process be given to a third party. And I was actually quite annoyed when I received that because I could not understand. There is a Treasury Department at the SABC whose task is also to collect revenues from SARS. And I simply said no, and there was a lot of unhappiness about it, but I said no.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Honorable Oliwe.
Thanks, Chair. Mrs. Mkhoba, when you tell your story, it's as if you were subjected to constructive dismissal. Why did you decide not to challenge it?
I think I mentioned earlier that I'm just a human being. I was exhausted. I got to a point where I felt there was nothing more that I could do. And I decided, if the writing is on the wall, why force myself to stay on when I was not wanted? And things were being done about me and being put in the press to destroy me further. I couldn't allow my family to sit and read newspaper article after newspaper article where false claims were being made about me. And it was also to protect my family.
The current chairperson of the board, or the last board, Mr. Makuve, came in whilst you were still there. Did you provide him with braille?
Yes, the braille was bought while I was there.
Then one other thing I want to check. In your view, are there any shortcomings that you could pick up out of the Memorandum of Incorporation?
The new Memorandum of Incorporation, which I have not engaged properly, not with the thoroughness that perhaps because I'd left, I'd lost interest. But it seems to me that it sought to supersede what the Broadcasting Act was about. And I may be wrong, I'm no expert in these things, but I do believe that the Broadcasting Act is superior to the Companies Act. That the Broadcasting Act addresses very specifically the entity, and it's not just a generalized document. And therefore, I don't believe that it's proper to try and superimpose the Act above, the Companies Act above the Broadcasting Act.
I'll drop the last question, Chair, because it was digging deeper also on the MOI. So because she has already indicated that she never concentrated on it much, let me not go there. Thank you.
Honorable Khoza.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Makhobo. Ms. Makhobo, you've indicated that it was during the tenure of Ms. Chabalala in particular that your operational performance was severely impacted upon, negatively impacted upon. Now, within the context of corporate governance and operational excellence, how would you characterize the two sets of relationships? The relationship between Mr. Motsoeneng and Dr. Ngubane, and the relationship between Ms. Chabalala and Motsoeneng. And again, if you could also indicate whether there was something about the two of them, because we've got to know it's public knowledge, but both of them did not have the necessary qualifications to occupy the positions that they were holding.
It's a difficult question that you're asking me, ma'am, because you're wanting me to give you a snapshot view of those relationships. I think they were completely wrong. if you appoint a CEO, surely the CEO has to be the head of the executive of the organization, and there can't be two heads. The function of the chief operations officer is to ensure that operations, and the operations being the radio stations and the television channels, are run effectively. And the reporting lines had to be COO to CEO. Yes, the three of us were executive directors on the board, and the three of us, therefore, would hold a level of joint responsibility in running the organization. However, from a board management of the executive perspective, I think the first line would have to be the CEO, and then let the CEO bring the COO in if it was necessary. I never had those problems with the CFO. And the three of us could be regarded as equivalents to a degree on the board, but I never had those problems with the CFO.
During your tenure, during 2013 during 2013-2014, the Auditor General reports and he recorded expenditure of over close to 3.4 billion. What would we attribute this to?
But largely, the cause was the misreporting on SEP. There were very serious problems with systems not being applied appropriately. And in some instances, and perhaps the majority of the instances, it had to do with approvals not being awarded correctly. So an individual would have a project that they were doing, but they would not process it through the correct approval lines. And therefore, that expenditure could then therefore not be accounted for in terms of the normal prescripts of appropriate accounting. So those kinds of things would end up going into the fruitless and wasteful expenditure. On the SABC television side, there was a very peculiar problem with very long-term, in fact, they were called greenfield contracts, where a contract would just go on and on and on and on. And you would find that the programming actually was not being used simply because there was no space. Mandate requirements had gone up, and therefore international content sometimes was bought and was never used. That's fruitless and wasteful expenditure. And that would happen very much in instances where bulk buying was being done blindly without also taking into account whether there was space on the channel to put the content in or not. So those were kind of like the big issues.
Did you take part?
No, sorry, time is up, ma'am.
Okay, sure.
Honorable Maslango.
Chair, thank you. Madam, what I wanted to know from you is, during your tenure, who was the appointing authority?
For which level, sir?
For your senior levels.
The CEO, CFO, and COO would be appointed by the board with the ascension of the minister. And the level below that, who would be the group executive members, would be appointed by the board, and they would then notify the minister. The level below that, which would be general management, would be appointed by the group executive, the group executive with the...
I'm fine there. Did you, as a group executive, make any irregular appointment during your tenure?
No.
so you're clean, you're fine. You knew that Mr. Mtswening did not have the required qualifications to the attorney.
Yes, I discovered that.
What action did you take?
Let me put it to you this way. When I was made aware that Mr. Mtswening had no qualification, it was within the context of, but wow, this guy really works. And that had come from a history of appointments and reappointments and him rising up the ladder as he went along. And the argument all the time was, he's extremely talented, and you cannot use qualifications to exclude a person who is that talented and knowledgeable.
Chair, the other question I would like to, do you have any documentation that you know of that is commercially sensitive in the SABC if it were to be presented to Parliament?
The only commercially sensitive documents I can think of are the agreements between the SABC and the content suppliers, in particular the international suppliers, and also the SABC and the advertising fraternity. The advertising fraternity in particular would have problems because they negotiate rates with all the broadcasters. So if a slot on Generations for the SABC, I'm just going to use a hypothetical figure, is 100,000 rands per 30 seconds. And Generations is equivalent to, I can't think of a maybe to Rhythm City on ETV, and you know, in the numbers, etc. And yet ETV is paid less. That potentially could be a problem. This is just a hypothetical thing. It's not that it's like that right now. But that is where the sensitivity would come in. But
board chairpersons who were in favor of him, where was his real power coming from? Because who was the minister at the time of appointed by Mr. Mtswening?
Yes.
What were the circumstances of that appointment? Was it a fair process in your view? And how would you then describe this meteoric rise from where he was to acting GCEO?
Mr. Aguma is a highly qualified man. He had worked at the AG as well. So at the time of his being brought into the SABC, it made perfect sense. The disclaimer of opinion was there. Things were not going well in terms of our audit processes. And it had been agreed that the headhunting process could be applied there. And he was indeed headhunted and brought into the company.
Okay.
His meteoric rise, I cannot talk to because it happened after I'd left.
After your term, right? Okay. Okay, and then you did a skills audit, and we're now told that this is the last one that ever happened by the AG. What was your findings in terms of your skills canvas, so to speak?
I don't have the exact percentages.
Sorry, can I just rephrase it? This is one I should have warned you that is under contest. Maybe we should ask the question. Because if you come with the findings, this is the one that they're refusing to give us. If I'll allow you one more minute, is there any reason why that report should not be made available to us?
No.
Well, I'll allow you one more second, sir.
I do believe that the report was actually presented to the portfolio committee. So it's no longer a secret document.
Yeah, because that was my that was the reason I was, because I wanted to know what it is that in the skills audit that we're not supposed to know.
The skills audit does not point to any specific individuals by name. It
Yeah.
gives percentages of skills and where problems were specifically, and looks at where the misalignments in particular were between individuals and the job functions that they needed to do and their ability to carry them,
Yeah.
and whether or not that was linked to their skills. That's what
Okay.
it does. It paints a canvas of,
So, in your view, there's no reason why this document should not be.
like I say, it was already presented to the then
Yeah.
Portfolio Committee
Okay.
on Communications, and it was publicized in the newspapers, as I recall. There was a
Yeah.
lot about it that was said.
Okay. And then also the AG spoke of irregular expenditure, and it's the board, it's the role of the board to then investigate irregular expenditure, and that task has not been done for the past 3 years or so. Can you tell us some of the issues that would have come up in your tenure as a CEO under irregular expenditure?
I think I explained that item a little earlier, where it had to do with employees not using the correct processes to have approvals for projects to be taken. And sometimes those projects were actually not appropriate, and therefore whatever was spent on them was a loss because they did not have any impact. But the more pervasive problem happened with content acquisitions, where certain content had been bought on evergreen contracts and yet could not be utilized. So payments were made, but there was just never enough space on any of the platforms to play out those. That was fruitless and wasteful expenditure.
All right. Last question. You spoke of threats, of people being sued, and so on and so forth. Where are those coming from?
I can't mention names, but I've been informed.
Can you give us just a general from the SABC?
Well, there's certain
or
individuals within the SABC.
who are threatening yourself?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I put mine? Then we can. Oh, no, it's fine. Put your point up.
Chair, we're trying to get an understanding of what's going on at the SABC. And the first question and the last question have not been answered. Now, the first question pertained to, from the Honourable Member of the EFF, where does Mr. Moseneng get his power from? Where does he derive it from? And it's very important that we get an idea of how come one individual is so powerful within such a big organisation and wields so much authority over other people. So I think, yeah, and then the last question as well is about who is threatening you. We need to know these. We need to know what's going on at the SABC. Thank you, Chair. And as Mrs. Mokhobo knows, she's protected here. So please, I implore you.
Chair, I think we have to be fair with our witnesses. We had made an undertaking that we are not going to put them in a compromised position. And if she feels, remember, we are not going to be with her when she steps out of this parliament. And I think we should let her answer what she is comfortable with. I honestly feel that we are pushing it too far, especially on the last question.
Thank you.
I need the wisdom of Solomon. No. Look, honourable members, I can, and I'm making the proposal because I think none of them are wrong. Can I have a private audience with this and any other witness as a first point of call, if you trust me as the chair, and let me make that call, because indeed, members, if when we write our own report, this is a matter that will divide us, then we can put it in the report that one or two issues. I mean, we've now gone through 5. I don't want us to mess it up for this one. So if you trust me, I'll have this one-on-one with her, evaluate whether I think it's going to substantially increase, because we haven't even gone through the process. At the end of the process, I'll evaluate those 5 or 6 that we are putting in embargo for now, collectively, and make that evaluation. I just don't want people to decide it's not worth our while coming back here tomorrow, and that they come here under the whip, so to say. That's just my proposal, that if we did it that way. Mr. Mokoena, only on that matter.
Yeah.
Mr. Mokoena.
No, Chair, I'm comfortable with your solution, and I'm also very sensitive to protecting her, especially. I asked those questions because I thought maybe she might be comfortable to answer, but if she's not, it's okay. But I think it would be correct that if she can do it in camera with you, it would be helpful. It would be extremely helpful. Thanks, ma'am.
Is there any violent opposition to that suggestion? No.
It's not volunteer.
No, I'm being silly when I say violent.
There's a principal position that we took as a committee.
Talk in the mic, sir.
Yeah. There's a principal position that we took in the committee that the protection of witnesses becomes paramount. In fact, to an extent that we mandated you to deal with certain details with regard to security witnesses. So I'll not want to go into that detail now, but I think I agree that privately you can engage on behalf of the committee. You can engage on such matters, and if there's a need to escalate, as we discuss as a committee, take it up from that level.
Can I just suggest something different? If it's a person who is no longer in the employ of a state institution, we can give them a little bit of room in terms of information they don't want to give us. But if it's someone who's employed by the SABC and we ask a question, they're under obligation to give us full information.
I'm not with you. Are you talking in connection with this man?
Yes. I'm saying, for example, if, to give an example, if Prof. Maguve comes later on and we ask him a question, he can't then say, no, I don't feel comfortable answering that. If it's a person who's under the employ of a state institution, the SABC, they have to give us full disclosure. But if it's someone who isn't, and they, then we can discuss it. We can give them a little bit of leeway.
Honourable members, and I suppose we learn as we go along. I'm very reluctant for this committee to be seen to be divided on our procedures. And I'm not saying that we must be all the same. That's why I don't want to open it up for debate, ma'am. I mean, there's 2 suggestions and I think this one doesn't take away from the suggestion we made. Can we leave it, and because it's sprung upon us now, we'll refine it in our own little corner and take it. I don't want to open it up publicly. We are not divided. Thank you. One question from my side, ma'am. Did I, and it follows up on the point that was made by Honourable Mokoena, did I understand you correctly to say that the skills audit, and we're talking specifically about the one that was conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers, was commissioned in your time?
Yes.
And also you now said at least 2 or 3 times to us that there is no reason why that thing should be, in the words of the legal advisor speaking on behalf of the board, the following documents will not be provided on the basis of privilege, and its disclosure may negatively impact on the commercial interest. Are you saying to this committee that this document in no ways would have impacted on the interest or on the commercial interest of the SABC? I'm talking about the skills audit that was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Oh, yes.
You confirm that it would?
I confirm that. I don't see how, really. I honestly don't see how.
Thank you very much. That then concludes the business for now. I beg your pardon.
We want to assure that there is no other person in the audience there, as we raised the matter earlier on, who would be disadvantaged as you close.
Yeah. Mahlangu has become my principal or a perfect, but it's fine. Is there anybody, not anybody, is there chairperson of the board, the CFO, the CEO, or the COO of the SABC present here? Because those are the only people that we will allow to answer. Abeko.
Sorry, Chair, I can't see them in here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ma'am Makgobo, it is with gratitude that we want to say to you, Siamita, we are still in meeting mode. Thank you very much, ma'am. If there were some uncomfortable moments, they were not intentional, but we want to get to the bottom of these things so that we are able to do a comprehensive and a thorough job, and we wish you well going forward. So thank you very much, ma'am, for your time. Much appreciated. You are free to go. Honorable members, it is 2 o'clock, quarter to 2. Back at 2. Unfortunately, this is what you guys said to me. The next one is at 2. We'll go to E249, E209. 2 o'clock sharp, we are back here.
inquiry prior to my taking of this oath or the presentation of any evidence.
So help me God. You get that?
Oh, so help me God.
Thank you. We deem that you then have sworn under oath to be truthful in all your interactions with this committee. Where's the timekeeper? Timekeeper is late, then we've got problems. What's the time? No, it's fine. It is 7 minutes past 2. You've got until 3 o'clock, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mavuso, can you, for the record, state your full names?
My name is Vosumos Goodman Moses Mavuso.
Can you briefly tell the committee your academic background and in terms of your qualifications and your profession, what do you do for a living?
I have a postgraduate diploma, and I've been a consultant until recently when I got employed by Parliament.
You were a board member, a non-executive board member of the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Can you tell us from what period till when were you a member?
I was appointed to the interim board of the SABC in 2013, I think around February, March, until September, and then thereafter appointed to the board as a full member from October 2013 until the 7th of October 2016.
You have made a statement. It is dated the 7th of December 2016. It is entitled Statement on the Inquiry by the Ad hoc Committee of the SABC board members, and it is a 3-page statement. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
With your permission, can this statement be handed in as part and parcel of the evidence before this inquiry?
Yes, sir.
Chair, I request that the statement be accepted as evidence and marked Annexure B. In your statement, on page 1, the second paragraph, and I want to read it, the matter relating to the breakdown in the governance edifice within the South African Broadcasting Corporation predates my appointment to the SABC board, but continued to escalate to even higher trajectory right up to the 5th of October. Can you unpack that statement for the committee?
Did you say for the court, sir?
Sorry?
Well, I thought you said I must unpack it for the court, so I was beginning to wonder whether we're in court.
Sorry, I mean, for the committee. I'm sorry if I said court. I'm referring to the committee.
Thank you. What I meant by my statement was that before I became a board member, I was quite aware about some of the dynamics that happened in the board prior to the one that I served on. I do recall that with the information that I was able to receive, particularly the governance review that was done by one of the audit companies, it was quite evident that what was happening in the previous board under the chairpersonship of Dr. Ngubane, seemingly there were quite a number of problems that were encountered. Amongst others, it was the relationship between board members and some of the board members with executive members or members of the executive committee. But most importantly, at the point at which I became a board member, it was quite evident also that some of the issues that were raised in the report were still affecting the current board. And there has always been what I call a common denominator throughout. It's the kind of rapport and relations that some of the board members would have with some of the executives, and for me that has always been problematic. And it's on those bases that I'm raising this as a sore point that required urgent attention, and even going forward, it will have to be attended to quite expeditiously.
Still on page 1 of your statement, paragraph 3, you refer to a governance review process that had been undertaken by the previous board. Can you shed light about the contents in brief, not in detail? Just give the committee a broad overview of what that review, the findings were.
Thank you. Amongst the issues that were raised in that review, I did allude to the first ones, but the other points which I think are worthy of consideration is the extent to which meetings would be arranged outside of the diarized meetings, either of the board or the board committees. In other words, there was an excessive proportion of meetings being undertaken, which from where I'm seated would appear to be inappropriate. That would be one element. The next point, which I thought is very important, is, as I did mention earlier on, of course, is that the body language that took place, or the body politic, let me put it that way, that took place between executives and some of the board members was in itself quite inappropriate. I can perhaps attest to that fact even currently, that it's still continuing.
What do you mean about the body language between the executives and some members of the board?
Just by way of illustration, the first port of call of any organization or institution would be the chief executive officer. I do believe that the relationship that is struck between the chief executive officer and the board is quite important, and any entry should be through the executive, the chief executive officer. An anomalous situation is prevalent within the South African Broadcasting Corporation, whereupon some of the board members would go directly to members of the executive without necessarily going through the executive or the chief executive officer. For me, that is quite anomalous. I don't believe it bodes well for good governance, because it does suggest that something untoward is happening, and it shouldn't be.
Which committees of the board did you serve?
I served in a number of committees, one of which was the Human Resources and Remunerations Committee. I served in we called it the PBS Committee, in other words, it dealt with the broadcasting matters. I also served in the Risk Committee and the Social and Ethics Committee.
Still on page 1 of your statement, you're referring to, I think it's the fourth paragraph, 1, 2, where you say there were definitely serious flaws and weaknesses in the governance of the board then. No, I'm sorry, I think I've asked that question. The second issue you're raising, you say there was no proper follow-up in respect of the audit findings. That's where I want us to zoom to. And the risk register was not strictly adhered to. Can you just unpack that for the committee? What do you mean by that?
What I meant was the report that I had set off, which covered the period during the chairpersonship of Dr. Ngubane. That's what the report outlined. And I do believe that some of the matters were actually attended to in the board in which I served, because there was a point at which the audit, should I say the audit trail, was substantially dealt with, and there were just a few items outstanding that required attention. But with respect to the risk register, I think that has always been a sticking sore. It's a matter that still requires attention as I speak right now, because you would see red lights flashing, because those issues would require attention. Matters pertaining to the extent to which security mechanisms are put into place and how the assets would be taken care of. To some degree, these were quite problematic. So what I was alluding to was a report that I found, that I saw, which was previously handled and done by an audit committee or an audit company on behalf of the SABC.
Section 1311 of the Broadcasting Act reads, the board controls the affairs of the corporation. Now, there were annual reports prepared by the Auditor General. There were findings, adverse findings, and there were certain actions that required to be taken by the corporation to remedy the identified deficiencies. How did the board ensure that those deficiencies are attended to by the executives?
If may I ask, sir, for which year?
During the period that you were the member of the board.
There was an instance whereby, I may not recollect the actual years, where the SABC received disclaimers. I think it was 2 years in succession. Subsequent to that, there was a greater preponderance towards addressing some of the deficiencies that were there. That happened around 2013, 2014, and there was progression in trying to clear and deal with those matters, which I believe was quite good. And I think one needs to give credit to the leadership at that point in time. I think it was Ms. Mokobo who was in charge of the process and making sure that those audit matters were attended to. There were others, of course, which were outside of the control of the corporation. Just to give an example, the issue pertaining to licenses, television licenses and all that, it was a sticking sore, and I think it was a problem that even now has not been resolved. I think it's going to take a little while to get to grips with it, largely because the understanding between the AG, the Auditor General, and SARS is quite divergent. It requires some kind of mitigation to be able to come to a resolution.
You have half answered my question because you're referring to a period when Ms. Mokobo was there. Now, we know that at some point, Ms. Mokobo had left the corporation. Can you take us from that process forward? How has the board ensured that the deficiencies identified by the Auditor General, a Chapter 9 institution, get to be attended to?
What has since transpired, in terms of my recollection, is that there has been a regression that has been happening. And again, I do believe that it's got to do with leadership. Most importantly, the kind of oversight role that the board would play over the executive was to a large degree undermined. And it then resulted into this regression that I'm referring to. I'm of the firm view that it could have been different if there was greater firmness. I'll give an illustration. The current chairperson was quite, or should I say he mollycoddled some of the executives, particularly the person who was acting in the position of Chief Operating Officer. And the kind of relationship they had was, for me, quite problematic. And there's been a common denominator, maybe taking you backwards just a little bit to indicate that from the report that I studied, that I checked during the Dr. Ngubani's chairpersonship, to the period when Ms. Shabalala was the chairperson, and to the current situation where Professor Magube is the chairperson, or was the chairperson, let me put it that way, there has been a common thread. And the common denominator has been one person, Mr. Motsweni. And that for me became a problem because it created a situation whereby the group chief executive officer has been undermined throughout.
You see, you were occupying a very special position, and your role was different to that of an ordinary member of the public watching these proceedings. You had a fiduciary responsibility towards the corporation. You're now saying there was a regression. What did you do as a board member? Forget about others, but what did you do to address these challenges you're pointing out?
In all the instances when something untoward happens, I always raised my objections. I could not be remiss of my responsibilities because in terms of my fiduciary duties, it was really up to me to make sure that I make a shout out when it is necessary. I never shied away from doing that, and I constantly made sure that I raise my concerns and make sure that that is expressed and captured in the minutes of either the board or any committee that I was serving on.
Were you alone in the board in seeing this regression you're referring to? If not, what other members of the board, what were the other members of the board doing to assist you on the issues you were raising to address this regression?
The reality of the matter is that I was not alone. There were others who were quite vocal, who expressed their views quite sharply, like Professor Kumalo, Mr. Krishnaidu, Mr. Ronnie Lubesi, Ms. Kalidis, and Ms. Zinde, and also Advocate Tembingosi Bonagel. We did express our views. More often than not, our views would end up being minority views. And it can be mentioned, if we were to be provided with the records of the minutes, you will actually see that this has always been the case.
Inasmuch as the accounting officer or the executive directors have a responsibility to implement a strategy approved by the board has a responsibility to support the executive directors, the management team, so that the strategy could be realized. The first question I want to find out is, in your view, did the board give the executives the necessary support to deliver on the strategic objectives of the institution?
Without any doubt, we did our best to support the executives in executing their responsibilities, because if we didn't, we'd be found wanting, wouldn't be doing our jobs, and wouldn't be worthy to be serving on that board.
There was a complaint, I'm not sure if you are aware. Ms. Mogobo had testified just before you came in, and she did raise concern about the lack of support from the board in certain instances. What will be your comment to that?
The implementation of the strategy is the responsibility of the executives. It is the duty of the board to have oversight in making sure that there is implementation of that strategy. There may be isolated incidents that I may not be aware of where the support was not provided, whether it is the board in its collective sense or maybe individual members, I may not be certain. But insofar as I do recollect, we did our utmost best. There may have been some other instances whereby there could have been differences in opinions insofar as the implementation is concerned. In those instances, I'm sure there would have been challenges. I may not be sure, unless if there's a specific matter, I can be able to respond to it.
There was a meeting that I'm interested in between the Minister of Communications in the form of Ms. Mutambi. The first meeting she had with the board. It was not a board meeting, but it was a meeting between the shareholder and the board. At that meeting, were there any particular issues that the minister had raised that had concerned you?
If my memory serves me well, it was between the 2nd and the 3rd of July 2014. We were at Magaliesburg for a strategic retreat of the Human Resources Committee, deliberating on a whole range of issues, the strategy and how to be able to make sure that it is implemented. It so happened that out of the blue, the minister appeared, and she was not part and parcel of that meeting, I must be frank. But because it was her first interaction with us, the program had to be changed to accommodate her. She was accompanied by a legal advisor and some of the advisors. And she, for all intents and purposes, indicated that she's not happy with what has been happening in the board. In fact, her actual words were that the board is not functioning accordingly. Therefore, it is dysfunctional. And she's got reasons to believe that this has to be remedied as a matter of urgency. It's an exercise that took quite a while, but the unfortunate part was that some of us were chided in that meeting for something that I couldn't even put my finger onto, that we were undermining the authority of the chairperson. At that stage, it was still Mrs. Shabalala, and some of the executives. It was one of the most difficult meetings that one attended. And it then gave an indication that we're going to have a long haul insofar as our relationship with the minister was concerned.
I gather that at some point the board, let me not say the board, certain functions of the board, certain powers of the board were through a document called Delegation of Authority Framework, delegated to the executive directors. Who was responsible for delegating the board functions to the executives?
Referring specifically to this document?
To the delegation of authority, yes.
Perhaps I may have to give a background. The question of the delegation of authority framework arose out of the amended version of the Memorandum of Incorporation. Ordinarily, the memorandum should be amended by the board and be able to submit it to SABC for approval or ratification and checking and all that. But we were surprised to know that it was done by the minister. If you look into the memorandum itself, it bears her signature, not the signature of the chairperson of the board, which is quite anomalous insofar as I'm concerned. A shareholder representative taking the responsibility of the board, for me, is a bit of a problem. That MOI changed a number of issues, including the responsibilities that ordinarily would have resided with the board, but were then transferred to the executives. It then gave rise to the development of, the delegation of authority framework to be accordingly amended. I would safely say that the authority and the powers of the board were usurped and be devolved directly to the executives, which for me was quite problematic. I thought I should just put it in that context. But obviously it had to come to the board for ratification, which normally is done at the point at which the annual general meeting of the corporation takes place, which is chaired by the minister, and that's what happened. It was just a rubber stamping exercise.
Now, the powers of a board, as per your explanation, gets to be taken away from the board, given to the executives by the minister. What does the board do with that state of affairs? What did you in particular do?
I must say that I was quite alarmed because it was an anomalous situation and the relationships were already on a rocky start. And it was quite evident that if anything was going to happen, it was going to be very rambunctious in how we're going to handle matters. And one would ordinarily try to defer to the minister with the hope that things would be done accordingly, but didn't pan out that way. So the point I'm making here is that it was quite an unfortunate situation, and one left it at that point.
So you never raised it yourself in the board meetings? You never canvassed this anomaly with your colleagues?
I wouldn't really sit back and not do anything about it. I did canvass my views with my colleagues, or at least some of my colleagues. It is quite unfortunate that it didn't resonate to the entire board to be reconsidered. And it was very clear that there was a solid line of divide between board members. And in that way, things didn't really augur very well, which of course led to some of the board members resigning much more prematurely.
It's a sensitive issue, and I want to stay a bit longer on this matter. The powers of a board are assumed without the board's consent. Does this matter get to be tabled in the agenda of a board meeting to be discussed?
If it was a normal board and a normal institution, that wouldn't have been a problem. It was a very unusual situation, fraught with a lot of contradictions, precisely because it required political muscle, in some instances, to be able to find resolution or expression. So if it was a company out there which is listed in any other way, it was going to be easy to do that. In this particular case, it has been very difficult, I must say. In fact, I may add to say that you certainly require a certain level of madness to can want to serve on the SABC board.
The Public Protector's report, when let me just get the correct citation of the report. When governance and ethics fail. You are aware of that report?
Very much so, sir.
Did that report ever serve in one of the board meetings to be considered?
If you don't mind, sir, I'd prefer to give you a background and then I can be able to clarify how it came about. The report of the Public Protector was treated in a very different manner. Just for starters, at the point at which it was released, when the public protector released that document, we were in a board meeting, and one of the board members, Ms. Khalidis, was able to download it and shared it with us at that point. But it became apparent that there was what you call an interim report that was released much earlier, I think it was a year before, around December or so, which report none of the board members had sight of, that interim report. We later discovered around January that indeed this is what transpired, and we posed the question to the chairperson, Ms. Shabalala. And she said no, she received the report. It was addressed to her specifically and not to board members, and it was written confidential, and she couldn't share it with us, which I found to be very odd. But in taking the process forward, at the point at which the report was shared amongst us by one of our colleagues, she was taken to task that she had no authority at all to circulate the document amongst board members. It's not a duty or responsibility. And of course, that was a very difficult situation, if I may say. Finally, when we had to get to deliberate on the report, after it was released, it was after about a month or so. We were told that it has to be split into streams, human resources, audit, or finance, etc., which was done by the chairperson, by the way. And we couldn't understand how this could have arisen, because ordinarily it should have been the board that does that and come up with a way forward. But as we were going through that process, there was a law firm that was appointed to guide us on how to handle the public protector's report, Kuno attorneys. And they were the ones who made responses to some of the remedial actions that were required directly to the public protector through the chairperson, without having processed that through the board. That for me was quite problematic. When we raised these issues, particularly in the Human Resources Committee, chaired then by Professor Khumalo, we were quite livid about this matter, because we felt that it was our duty and our responsibility as board members, because it was quite evident that some of the matters that needed to have been done related to human resources, matters pertaining to actions that must be taken against those who have been found wanting, particularly Mr. Motsweni, issues pertaining to increase in remuneration and salaries, etc. All those matters require the Human Resources Committee and the Audit Committee to be able to look into. But it was not handled appropriately or properly. And that for me was quite problematic. It was a bone of contention. We continued to fight around that. Even to date, I don't believe we had ever come to a resolution of that.
As a board member, giving the committee an objective view and also understanding that this response will implicate you, would you then say the board dealt with the public protector's report in the correct way or not?
I'll add to what I said earlier on. I did indicate that it was not appropriately handled, and I do believe that it could have been done differently. I'm of the firm view that with the necessary passion, the necessary gumption, and the necessary preparedness, it could have been done differently, but it wasn't.
There was a special board meeting. You're referring it in your statement, paragraph 2. Sorry, in page 2, relating to the appointment of the acting COO as the permanent CEO. Can you share with the committee how that came about?
After the meeting of the 2nd and 3rd of July, having met with the minister in Magaliesburg, I think it was on a Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, we received notification that an urgent board meeting is going to be convened where the minister would want to interact with us. It was scheduled for the 7th. I think it was on a Monday. Interestingly, it was in the evening, around 6 o'clock, when this meeting was planned. Arriving at the SABC, there was no minister to be seen. Instead, the meeting was chaired by Ms. Shabalala. She told us that there's an instruction that we need to exercise or to execute. It relates to the appointment of the chief operating officer. Before she could say very much, she flashed a letter purportedly coming from Mr. Motswaning's lawyers, indicating that he's been acting in the position for quite a considerable length of time and extolling his virtues about his achievements within the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and therefore suggested, or not only suggested, but more or less gave an injunction that he's got to be appointed on a full-time basis as the chief operating officer. I took umbrage to this because it was quite anomalous, it was problematic. I raised my concerns that if there's anything that ought to be done, there must be due process that has to unfold. And due process implies that the position has to be advertised. It must be able to articulate quite clearly what the job description is, the role specification, the minimum qualification requirements of the position. There must be a service provider appointed to be able to do the shortlisting process in order to make sure that it is a transparent process. But most importantly, there must be a panel constituted to interview the shortlisted candidates, conduct interviews, but also there must be a competency assessment included within that broad framework. And finally, the 3 names, in terms of what the Act says, can then be submitted to the minister for her consideration and probable recommendation, and the name that emerges will then have to be ratified by the board. I'm listing these steps intentionally because none of these were done. It was I don't know how to put it, it was like a skopskieten donor, whereby we were literally cajoled into making sure that we come to a decision that very evening. It was a long night because I think it went on until about 11 in the evening, whereby, as it has been the tradition then, if we do not have consensus, because I do believe that, especially in a board, you need to have a collegial kind of relationship. Even the leadership must be such that you try to move towards a consensual arrangement. That wasn't the case. It is quite evident that this was already prejudged, and there could have been a meeting of some grouping before the meeting, and they'd come to a decision. So when a vote was demanded, not even requested, we were then told that it has to be done that very evening, and a vote ensued, and the majority of the board members recommended that Mr. Motswaneng should be the COO.
How did you vote at that meeting? Did you support the recommendation for his appointment, or did you abstain, or did you vote against?
I was very clear in my mind that I was not going to legitimize an illegitimate process. And my standpoint was very clear that I'm not going to give it any sense of credibility by voting for it, so I actually abstained.
We now know that there's a Western Cape High Court judgment that found that outcome, the outcome of that process, Mr. Motswaneng's appointment, to be unlawful and irrational. Did that come as a surprise to you?
On the contrary, I was vindicated.
how did the board exercise financial oversight over the executives?
Ordinarily, the process is as follows. A number of committees are set in place. There's a committee that dealt with audits, the audit committee. There was a committee that dealt with matters pertaining to finances and procurement of goods and services. And of course, there were others that were there, but specifically around financial matters, certainly the CFO and the CEO would report to the committee, who would then make recommendations that will have to be ratified by the board. That's the manner in which the exercise was, or the oversight was done over the executives around financial matters.
You know there is a decision on local content. The 90-10% local content for radio and 80-20% local content for television. Was the board ever involved in the development of this important policy decision?
I served